Our Torah reading this morning is the double parsha, Mattot-Masei. In our triennial, we just read, as we do the last third, selections from Masei. Masei, at the beginning, presents a description of the journey from Egypt to the Promised Land, and lists 72 stops. Among the stops listed, beginning with the crossing of the Sea of Reeds, is the place of Tzin, where the manna first appeared, and Rephidim, where the Israelites complained about the lack of water, and Moses struck the rock the first time to bring forth water. There's Kibrot HaTa'ava, where the people angered God by demanding meat to eat. The 72 places represent the best of times and the worst of times, the long, hard journey. And the rabbis will discuss why all of these stops, why these details, why 72. And they will say it's because in these 72 stops is the memory of how God was there for the people, precisely in good times and bad times. A midrash is provided, an imagining of the rabbis of a father who had a sick son, and he had to travel a long way to find care for that son. And after the son was feeling better, the dad recounted each stop, saying, "Remember, we stopped there and you had a headache. And then we stopped there and you were weak and I had to carry you." Recounting the journey to enable the celebration even more of having regained his health. There's a book that I began to read just this morning, prompted by my teacher, Jack Reamer, who I always mine for ideas. It's a book I actually had in my study at home that came out just this last year, published by Jewish Lights Publishing. It's a book with the title, The Holy Deaths of Hasidic Masters, written by Rabbi Joel Barron and a colleague of his who is a hospice rabbi. It's a translation of a book written in Israel in 1935 by a man named Rabbi Mintz. He was still in his 20s. And he presented the final hours of 72 Hasidic masters. And he says, why did he select 72? Because of our Torah reading, of the 72 stops. Also in the sense of seeking to convey that the transition to the afterlife is the transition to the Promised Land. I read a number of those accounts this morning, descriptions of the final hours of these Hasidic masters, seeing their journey in life as a life of greater dignity because of the belief that the last breath would be to a transition of wholeness. In that regard, reading to find ideas, I read yesterday, looking for stories, one of my favorite storybooks. It's by Rabbi Elie Feinstein, my favorite contemporary storyteller, the Rabbi of Valley Beth Shalom in the Valley. And Rabbi Feinstein has a book called Capturing the Moon, which is a Chelm story. He is not only a masterful storyteller, he is a masterful writer of stories. Here's an aside that you may not know about my friend Eddie. When he went to the University of Santa Cruz, he was chosen by his classmates to be the keynote speaker among graduates at the UC Santa Cruz graduation. So he had that talent to both be an outstanding student but an outstanding speaker very early on. That son of a baker has this enormous gift of energy and creativity. The first story in that collection of short stories is called Paradise. And I share this story in honor of the journey of Rose and Hal. Adam and Eve had a long life. And after the children had grown up and established their own life, they decided, now that I have to do it the way Elie would do it, which is as a storyteller. 1 second. All right. Adam and Eve, the children have grown up, and their lives had been very demanding. They didn't get a chance to travel when the kids were still at home. Only by the sweat of his brow did he make a living, and she was busy. And so finally now they reached another phase where they can see God's creation, the beauty of the world that they had longed to see. And so in this new phase of life, they begin to travel. And they see the majesty of the mountains. And they say, "Oh, such beauty! For this we were created to acknowledge God's achievement of snow-capped mountains." And they traveled and they saw mighty streams with power and fish swimming upstream. And they said, "Such beauty! What a wonder is our world." They traveled far and wide, and they took their time taking in the gift of creation. And amidst their journey, they found themselves to a place that was familiar, a place identified also with great beauty. They found themselves standing in front of the Garden of Eden. But they weren't able to enter. For at the Garden of Eden were cherubs, cruvim with swinging swords. And they looked at each other after their long life. It was a faint memory of when they had lived on the other side of that entrance. And then they heard the voice of God. "Eve, Adam, this is God. The garden. Remember how I would talk to you in the garden, walking in the midst of the day? Come on in." And the angel's sword came to a standstill, and he motioned toward the entrance. They looked at each other. And Adam said, remind Eve what awaits us. If we enter the Garden of Eden, what will we have? And God said, don't you remember? In the Garden of Eden, there is no future and there is no past. In the Garden of Eden, all your needs are met. You live fully in the present. The fruit is there for the picking. There is no hardship. There is no longing. Here in the Garden of Eden, there's only repose. And as Rabbi Feinstein continues the story, Adam looked at Eve. She was no longer the young woman he had received in that garden from his side. Her face had shown the years. And in looking into her eyes, he couldn't help but recall the hard times and the good times. In looking in her eyes, he couldn't help but remember the pain of the birth of their children and how she had nobly mastered and managed with dignity and in celebration to give birth. He couldn't help but, in looking at her, to recall the moments of sadness where things hadn't gone the way they had wanted and where there had been disagreements. And as he looked in her eyes, he saw the love that he felt for her. And she, as he looked at him. He too no longer was as handsome. But as she looked in his eyes, she recognized his dignity. And how, in those good times and in those bad times, he had always been there, drawing on an inner strength, and how they had been there for each other. They looked into each other's eyes, and they turned to the Garden of Eden, the place where there is no past or future, just the present. They took each other's hands and said, "Let's go home." That beautiful story, called Paradise, is the recognition that in our lives there are challenges, there are ups and downs, and there's a richness that entails owning the past and looking to the future, acknowledging the fragility of life and that it is limited in years. And so it was, paradise was found in living a life that has ups and downs. Ribono Shalom, Master of the universe, in Mattot-Masei, we recall the journey from slavery to the cusp of the promised land. 72 stops, many of pain, many of rejoicing. We are with our ancestors on the cusp of a tomorrow. May we look forward by holding precious our past and living in the present. Amen.